Hi everyone. In this video, we would be learning about dependency inversion, which is one of the solid principle. So let's understand this with the help of one example. So first, we'll try to understand the flow of a request from front end to back end. Okay. So assume that this is the front end, for example, your browser. So the request that you would be making will first go to the controller layer in the backend. Okay. So let's say you want to fetch the user data, or data specific to a particular user. So the API would look something like this. Now the controller will call a function from the service layer. Okay. So it will call the function from the service layer, and service layer is basically responsible for handling the business logic. Right. This service layer will interact with the SQL repository, and SQL repository will fetch the user data, and it will give that user data to the service layer. Right. And this service will send that user data to controller, and controller will send back to client. So this is the normal flow of a request. Right. So the point to note over here is, in order to fetch the user data from the SQL database, this SQL repository is using get function. Okay, it is using get function in order to fetch the user data. So the code in the service layer at that point of time would look something like this. Like we would have a reference variable like SQL repository repo, because we are pointing to the SQL repository. And since we want to fetch the user data, we would be using repo dot get id. We want to get the user by id. So we are calling repo dot get. So till now, everything is working perfectly. But let's say I want to migrate from SQL DB to MongoDB. Okay. So in that case, obviously I have to point my service layer to the Mongo repository, isn't it? But one thing to observe over here is, in order to fetch the user data from the MongoDB, this Mongo repository is using find function. It is not using get function, right? So this is the first point. It means that wherever in the service, wherever you were using get function, now you have to replace it by find function. So let's say there were 100 places where you were using get. So now you have to go and make all of them find function. Okay. This is one thing. Second is, obviously we are pointing to Mongo repository. It means that the reference variable should also be Mongo repository. So these are couple of changes that you have to make when you are migrating from one database to another. Okay. And this is clearly the violation of dependency inversion. Dependency inversion says that your high level module, so over here, high level module is service layer, should not depend on low level module, which is repository layer. Okay. Now, why high level module should not depend on low level module? Because then the system becomes tightly coupled. We clearly saw that when we were changing, that is, when we were going from SQL repository to Mongo repository, we were also changing the service layer code like this. Hence, the system was tightly coupled. So, in order to overcome this particular tight coupling, we have to follow dependency inversion. That is, the service and repository both should depend on the abstraction. Let's see that. Yeah. So here we can see that the service class and the repository classes are both dependent on the abstraction. So over here we are using interface as the abstraction. And this will solve the problem that we were facing of tight coupling. So first problem was here we were having the get function for SQL repository in order to fetch the data. And in the repository, we were having find function. But since both of them are implementing the I repository, it means that both have to override the get function. So now Mongo repository will also have the get function in order to fetch from the MongoDB database, right? So now you don't have to replace this thing. And the second thing was obviously earlier you were having SQL repository reference variable, and then you were pointing to MongoDB reference variable. Mongo repository reference variable, right? But now you don't have to do that because they both are child of I repository. They both are implementing the I repository. Okay. So the reference would be I repository, right? So now if let's say in future I want to add Postgres database. So for that we would have a Postgres repository which would have the get function, and again it will be implementing this I repository. Hence we don't have to change the code in the service layer. So now we have designed the system which is loosely coupled because we are following the dependency inversion principle. So I hope you got the dependency inversion principle. So now let's check out the code. So this is the code for violation of dependency inversion principle. So over here, this is our service class, and here we are using the reference type of SQL repository. Okay. So in future, if I want to use Mongo repository, then I have to come here and change this to Mongo repository, product Mongo repository, like this. So this is the code for violation of dependency inversion principle. Now let's check for non-violation code. Okay, so we saw that we have to create a interface, right? So I've created the I repository interface, which will have all the abstract functions like this. Now, any repository which is implementing I repository should override the add and get function, right? So SQL repository is overriding both of them, and Mongo repository is also overriding both of them. And in future, if I want to have more databases, then I can have different repositories and make it override the functions add and get. Now, in the service class, I just have to have this I repository type, right? This is what we saw in the explanation part. And so we don't need to change this particular way reference again and again because we have decoupled the repository from the service layer. And yeah, this was one thing. And again, these are the functions that this repository will be using, add and the get functions. So now what I'm doing is I'm just injecting the dependency. Like if I want the SQL repository, then I'll just inject the SQL repository into this variable. And if I want the Mongo repository, then I'll again inject it via constructor based dependency injection into this variable. Okay. I could have also used setter based dependency injection as well. And yeah, don't get confused between dependency inversion and dependency injection. Dependency inversion is the solid principle that we are learning till now. And dependency injection is a technique in order to inject a dependency into the variable, right? Okay. So I hope you understood the code for the dependency inversion principle. So if you did, then please like the video and share this with your friends. Thanks.